Hi, and welcome to America Becomes a World Power, Imperialism. And in this video, we're going to take a look specifically at the Spanish American War to include the role of the media, the USS Maine, the war in Cuba, the Teller Amendment, the Philippines, and differing opinions on imperialism. Okay, so let's begin. So, first of all, we want to take a look at Cuba, the island nation, about 90 miles from the tip of Florida, from the United States. Cuba basically was one of the last of the Spanish colonies in North America. And by the late 18th century, turn of the 19th century, Cuba, or Spain rather, had a tenuous grasp on Cuba, and there were major Cuban uprisings against the colonial masters. There were two newspaper publishers at that time, Pulitzer and Hearst, and of course you probably have heard of the Pulitzer Prize in terms of writing. But anyway, these were two early publishers of major newspapers, and they engaged in something known as yellow journalism. In 1898, newspapers provided public with information. This is a time before, of course, the internet and radios and things of that nature. So people lacked the ability to verify stories were based on were biased or inaccurate, and therefore relied upon newspapers to tell the truth. There was no really other way to get information. But Pulitzer and Hearst took advantage of the public's ignorance by twisting the truth of a particular story in the attempts to sell more newspapers. They did this by sensationalizing stories which were featured heavily in their newspapers. And since exciting headlines increased circulation, there was more of a kind of an impetus to create more sensationalistic headlines. And from this time, there's this popular saying in journalism: if it bleeds, it leads, meaning those are the types of stories that you will most likely find on the front page of a newspaper. So the newspapers focused on Spanish atrocities committed towards the Cuban people in an attempt to kind of ignite passions against Spain. And you can see that clearly in this political cartoon showing the United States as the guardian of the fair Cuban maiden against the treacherous, diabolical Spain. The U.S. public was especially sympathetic towards women in Cuba. Hearst focused on a young woman known in the United States as Evangelina Cisneros, who was imprisoned in Havana, that's the capital of Cuba. Petitions for her freedom were signed by prominent U.S. women and the Pope and addressed to the Queen Regent of Spain. Evangelina managed to escape with the help of a correspondent who probably bribed her guards. The story presented to the public was that of a heroic journalist that acts, so taking kind of an active role in her freedom. All that was needed to start a war between the United States and Spain was the spark, as the yellow journalists essentially turned the public's opinion decidedly against the Spanish rather. And that event is going to happen on that event is going to happen in Havana Harbor regarding the USS Maine, which was an American ship stationed there. And the Maine blew up, killing many American sailors, and in the process was the spark that was needed to ignite the war between Spain and the United States. Let me show you some original footage taken in 1898. This is of the wreck of the battleship Maine. This movie is taken, or was taken, in April 21st of 1898. Okay. So yellow journalists were quick to blame the Spanish, even though there was no conclusive proof indicating that it was the Spanish who was responsible for the USS Maine blowing up. And there became a popular battle cry within the United States: "Remember the Maine." So here's another political cartoon uh, representing the Spanish atrocities committed against the Americans. Here's another one depicting Spanish misrule, and the woman in the frying pan represents the Cuban people, and of course underneath it is the fire of anarchy. In the war with the Spanish, the United States was quick to use the latest technology in its fight, including this machine. This is called the Gatling gun, and it was used in the American Civil War towards the end. Um, and it's basically kind of the forerunner of the modern machine gun, and it worked on the principle of rotating barrels. Well, that didn't really sound like a gun, did it? Oh well. Okay, this is a scene from the Spanish-American War of the Rough Riders, as this unit was called, led by none other than Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. And this is the Battle of San Juan Hill. Here's another picture of Theodore Roosevelt. You can see him in the middle here, and his Rough Riders surrounded around him. I should point out that Theodore Roosevelt quit his position as Secretary of the Navy in order to put this unit together and to fight in the Spanish-American War. Next, I'd like to show you guys a video of the Rough Riders in a skirmish. I should just point out that some of the very first movies made were of the Spanish-American War. You know, it's not clear whether or not this is a kind of a posed video or whether or not this was an actual combat situation. My feeling on it is that it was most likely rehearsed or posed. What they're doing here is these horses on the ground were essentially moving sandbags or bullet catchers. The Rough Riders and other types of infantry would train their horses to lie down, in which the soldiers would then hide behind them. Um, Not great for animal rights, I suppose. Okay, as a result of the Spanish-American War and the American victory over the Spanish, the Americans put into place something called the Teller Amendment of 1898. And essentially what this meant was that the Cuban people ought to and would become a free and independent state, free of Spanish and of American interference. And essentially that's what the amendment stated. However, that's not what's going to happen. All right, let's talk about the Philippines. The Philippines was a Spanish colony that was essentially taken by the Americans after the victory in Cuba. Okay, so the Americans get involved in the Spanish, or I should say the fight in the Philippines at Manila Bay. And here's a couple of scenes from that. The hero of that fight is a man named Admiral Dewey, who was, of course, the American naval commander who very decisively, very quickly is able to defeat the Spanish Navy there. The United States will proclaim the Filipino uh, independence, but that's only going to last for a few years as the United States begins to assert hegemony in the Philippines, at which time there is a insurrection led by Aguinaldo, who is going to try to kick the United States out of the Philippines, and you're going to have several years of brutal uh, warfare, guerrilla tactics on both sides. Okay, so here's the arguments in favor of imperialism or taking over the Philippines. And again, this is from Senator Alfred Beveridge, who is a Republican from Indiana. And this speech comes to us from 1900. Just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. We will not renounce our part in the mission of our race, trustee of God, of the civilization of the world. So there's some of that social Darwinism. Where we shall turn for consumers of our surpluses. I should just point out, even back then in the 1900s, China still had a very sizable population, and it was seen as a fertile, if you will, ground for American consumer products. China is our natural customer. England, Germany, and Russia have moved nearer to China by securing permanent bases on her borders. The Philippines gives us a base at the door of all of the East. They, the Filipinos, are a barbarous race, modified by 3 centuries of contact with the decadent race, the Spanish. It is barely possible that 1,000 men in all the archipelago are capable of self-government in the Anglo-Saxon sense. The Declaration of Independence applies only to people capable of self-government. How dare any man prostitute the expression of that very elect of self-government peoples to a race of Malay children of barbarism, schooled in Spanish methods and ideas? And you, who say that the Declaration applies to all men, how dare you deny its application to the American Indian? And if you deny it to the Indian at home, how dare you grant it to the Malay abroad? Well, not all people were for imperialism across the world, and there were some people in the United States who were very vociferous against imperialistic tendencies, and 2 of these names we know already. Mark Twain said, quote, "We do not intend to free, but to subjugate the people of the Philippines. We have not gone there to conquer, not to redeem." We have gone there to conquer, not to redeem. Another name that we are familiar with is William Jennings Bryan, and he says, quote, "In the forcible annexation of the Philippines, our nation neither adds to its strength nor secures broader opportunities for the American people." So you can see from this timeline how the United States quickly became an imperial power at the end of the 19th century. First in Hawaii in 1898, Midway, Wake Island, Guam, Johnston Island, Palmyra Island, Samoa Island, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico, which, by the way, was also a Spanish colony that was taken over by the United States at the Spanish defeat of the Spanish-American War. This is a reaction to U.S. imperialism and anti-imperialist movement. This league, by the way, is going to gel under the title Anti-Imperialist League. And the Anti-Imperialist League, as I had mentioned before, featured many prominent Americans, including Mark Twain, who were very adamant against American imperialism. Here's a political cartoon showing Uncle Sam with the fruits, I guess, of imperialism. Notice over here the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Hawaii. How are these imperialists, or how are these colonies being interpreted according to this political cartoon? Do you think it's a pro or anti imperialistic cartoon? Okay, so that ends our talk on the Spanish-American War, and thanks for listening.